That's the kind of comical attempts that many of us to do a microphone. The IT person came.
With the, yeah.
It's like in every class.
Yeah. But then you get the drive. Well, actually, there has to be.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be thinking about this like late at night. I'm like, what setting could we have changed? Yeah, I mean, there must be. I don't know. Especially because it works in your. I feel like if I was like, oh, it didn't work in any other setting, I was like, it's the technology's fault, but it's clearly not because it works in a different setting. Of course, are you gonna be sitting there just because I'm thinking about the recording and you're like half in at like a weird angle? So yeah. Yeah, I think that would be slightly better.
You made it. How is it?
Let's go to generic email calendar, all of those. Certain whether they go on of those relocating, yes. Okay. Or they can asking us. Make another stage. Right. See what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to see that. Like stage application. I think the fact that there's develop something. Yeah. And polish it for the students. Right. That's good. And the place and power thing's good too. Yeah. Did that happen?
Should we just start early? Okay, we're gonna get started. These are only an hour long. I would usually wait 5 or 10 minutes, but since we only have an hour, I think we'll try and leave some time for questions. And we have food coming as well at 2 o'clock. So welcome everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that this event is being held on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And that I hope we can continue to expand on conversations about Indigenous sovereignty and settler colonialism throughout our time here as they relate to the work we do and the spaces that we inhabit. We also conduct our work within a city that itself is located on territory that was never ceded or given up to the crown by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and is fragmented by race, class, gender, and sexuality, and that we in GRSJ continue to contend with the explicit and implicit ways that these violences manifest. As we gather here in a series that discusses disability, the body, and illness, we ask that everyone keep their masks on for the duration of the event. At the end of the event, 2 p.m. catering will arrive, and there are some masks in a box. Yeah, thank you, Elena. With food for us, and at that time, you can choose to stay in the room or the lobby or just food wherever. But please feel free to stick around and ask questions or mingle. Just please feel free to eat the food as it arrives. We often have a lot of leftovers, and I think it all mostly gets eaten, but sometimes not. We are also currently living within a time of unfathomable colonial violence, and for me, it is often in these times that to fathom the unfathomable invokes speculations rendered through works of the imagination. It is by writing within the currents of our current moment that I hope this conversation proceeds to take into account the now 11 days of destruction and death occurring in Palestine under the current colonial occupation. And I hope that with all this in mind, we can continue to think about speculation, think about imagination, think about our own perceptions of reality. And with all that, I do want to introduce our speaker today. I'm very grateful that she's here and made time for us. And this is also her debut speaking in Vancouver. And her name is Karen Lord. So let me introduce her. Karen Lord's debut novel, Redemption in Indigo, won a lot of awards. I hope you don't mind if I don't read them all out. It might take a while. Its sequel, the crime fantasy novel Unraveling, was published in 2019. Lord's other books include the science fiction trilogy, Now the Best of All Possible Worlds and The Galaxy Game, and her latest book, The Blue Beautiful World, that was recently published in August 2023. Let's see, she also edited the anthologies New Worlds, Old Ways, Speculative Tales from the Caribbean, and Reclaim, Restore, Return, Futurist Tales from the Caribbean. Dr. Lord's talk today is titled Many Ways of Being Human, and explores how Lord's science fiction uses real and fictional differences in human cognitive abilities to imagine societies shaped by other norms and expectations of what constitutes neurotypical behavior. Concepts of personhood, adulthood, class, and disability vary as a result, thus demonstrating how the standards for social inclusion and exclusion are rarely absolute. So thank you all for coming. Let's please welcome our speaker, Karen Lord.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I'm afraid you're not going to be getting the best of me today. I am sick. I do have a very bad sore throat. That's why this is right under my mouth. I will occasionally take the mask off to sit. I took a COVID test, it's negative. So I just want to reassure you about that. And I'm going to try my best to be as succinct as possible, simply because I'm trying to get my voice to last out in time. So I originally planned to tell you about my background, but I'm actually going to skip that. I'll just say that I am a scientist, I am a socioeconomic researcher in a past life. So a lot of what you see coming into my books is not only research I've done for the fiction, but also research I've encountered in my work and in my studies. I also should mention that I did a stint in diplomacy as well in foreign affairs. So what you see on the screen before you is this trilogy we're talking about, the space opera. I call it the Cygnus Beta novels. Starts with The Best of All Possible Worlds, continues with The Galaxy Game, and has a third novel now, The Blue Beautiful World. Now, I did not want to necessarily write about aliens. It's very clear that the different, shall we say, denizens of these planets are different kinds of human. I was inspired by, I'll just show you this, recent research on the Neanderthals and the fact that we still have some of their DNA existent in lineages in various parts of the world, and also the Denisovans. That's another group as well. So when I describe to you the different peoples on these planets, I do want you to imagine that I'm not talking about aliens, I'm not talking about people who don't have a connection with us. I am indeed talking about other kinds of humans. So, what makes these humans different? I went back to a classic science fiction trope, the telepathy, the empathy, societies that are built and structured around that. You see a lot of that in Star Trek already. There's a lot of it in some of the classical novels from the 50s and 60s. And in doing that, I wanted to examine mainly the use of power, and also the way what we see as power, what we see as disability is very much changed according to the environment that we're in and the expectations that are on us. I made a little list that I'm going to read through. So the things I'll say about is, first of all, the way your brain works, whether it's within the average for that society, the way you're socialized. We can have a very neurotypical approach, but if we're socialized differently, that can stand out when it comes to another norm of society. The way the society is structured, we talk a bit about colonialism and class and so forth. And when you examine those, often what you find is that the society is structured in a way that purposely disadvantages certain groups. And I guess I do see that as a kind of a disability. The infrastructure itself, by infrastructure, I mean things like your transportation, whether you can get easily from one place to another, even things like your school system. You also have to look at what is stigmatized and what is celebrated. We have things that people look at and say, oh, somebody's a little different, they're a little strange in this way, but it's not a problem, or this is something you can celebrate. But then another culture look at it and say, oh no, that's beyond the pale, that's too much. So they're not necessarily different, But I mean, a very good way to give an example of that is different societies' views on sex and sexuality, for example. You can have widely different reactions to that, depending on how the society has been tailored to respond to that. Then you have attitudes around disease, injury, aging, and death. Once more, this does vary from society to society. There are some societies where the concept of aging is, I don't quite want to say built in, but there's this understanding that we will become elders one day, and that the same way you take care of your young, you take care of your old. And your society has been structured in a way to accept that and not to exclude anyone who is reaching that stage of life. Similarly, with injury and disease, well, some societies are very exclusionary when it comes to that. If you are sick, if you are injured, you're supposed to shut yourself away. You're not supposed to be out in the mainstream. But then there are others that are more inclusive. And then the last one I have is the expectations of the role that you need to play at particular points in your life. And I say that from the point of view of, if you are childbearing age, in some societies, there's this expectation that your next rite of passage should be to have a child. Specifically, in the best of all possible worlds, I am looking at a society which has just experienced an attempt at genocide. They have now a gender imbalanced society where most of the women died, and now there are more men. And when you read the book, it looks as if they're almost obsessed with procreation. They're almost obsessed with, we have to find wives, we have to find our families again, and continue to thrive and sort of push back against people who want to see us disappear. So you get this, it's a sort of a special circumstance here, but you get this idea of you're supposed to be focused on this as the most important thing in life. And if you don't see it as that, maybe there's something wrong with you. So there are all kinds of ways in which how we structure things or how things are structured around us means that we are either sort of fully seated in the norm or fully accepted and included, or we find ourselves on the margins. Now, I'm going to go to, this is supposed to help me out a bit in terms of the, this is supposed to help me because I can't necessarily say all these words very well, but I've just given you a quick primer on the people we can expect. I mentioned Sadira. They're the ones who, think of them almost as the policemen of the galaxy, diplomats and policemen of the galaxy. They're very highly respected. They're the telepaths. They have a colony called AIM, but AIM is a prison colony. It's very distant. And it's the fact that they have such a distant prison colony should tell you that the way they deal with the difference in their society is to send it off the planet. When people are, not fitting in, when they're not, operating according to the norm, when they are using their telepathy in ways that's considered to be abuse of power, they will send them off the planet. Of course, this comes back to bite them because it's AIM that actually kicks off the event that causes the planet Sadira to become unable to sustain life. We also have Nishune, and they are the planet of empaths. They have a colony called Punartum, and they feature more in the galaxy game, but they are important because they are of strong influence in one of the planets I'll mention a little later on. Xenu, A and B, they're very much into the machinery. They tend to have connections to artificial intelligences and to cyborg type arrangements. And then there's Terra, that's us. And we are just so immature that they have embargoed us. They have basically said nobody is to come and visit them. They need to work out their stuff for a while. And in a way, that's partly the result of the history between Sadira, Nishune, and Xenu, because Xenu is the junior one. And they recognize that in trying to shepherd Xenu, they probably didn't help them. They probably didn't allow them to develop by themselves in the ways that were necessary. So now the idea is that hands off Terra, let them develop the way they need to develop, and then when they're ready to join the galactic group, you'll reach out to them. Why is Cygnus Beta then a colony of Terra? So this is where the myth comes in. I always like to sprinkle a little myth into my science fiction. Cygnus Beta is supposed to be a planet of survivors and refugees. Whatever huge genocidal event you can imagine on Earth, the idea is that some entity, not anybody from these planets, somebody with more powers and more mystic something around them, plucked a few survivors from each event and transported them to Cygnus Beta. So it's almost like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, you know, somebody just like leading you into a cave and then you come out somewhere else completely different. And that is a useful place for me to start my arc because I can include enough references to Earth and to the things that are familiar to us as I start to introduce to things that are a lot less familiar. Good. So, so that's the background. And I'm going to mention now, let's see if I can do this. These are some names that are important. The names that are important for the best of all possible worlds are Glenach and Delarue. I'm glad I can only say that once on my throat. Why does Glenach have the name that he has? So he's Siberian. And the point that's made very early on in the book is that people never pronounce his name right. And it stands out when someone does pronounce his name right. The protagonist, Delarue, she does in fact pronounce his name right from the very beginning. And you know, in a way that's how she kind of comes to his attention. And there's that aspect of when you are in some place that is totally alien and totally different, and people are not even pronouncing your name, they're adapting it to whatever they're comfortable with. So that's one of the reasons he has that name. Why is Delarue Delarue? Again, we're just looking at names that have some kind of Earth origin, that have some kind of past history. Delarue is actually someone who's got some West Indian background as well, because I can do that. And you know, all of this, the names themselves have meaning. Now, the whole book, Best of All Possible Worlds, has been actually described as a road trip. And it's a road trip of an exploration diaspora, because in search of the wives to rebuild their families, the Sidiri decide to visit communities throughout Cygnus Beta that have Sidiri that have emigrated there from other eras. And what they discover about diaspora, what we've all discovered, is that societies are always evolving. So even though they've come with their norms and their expectations of this is the margins in which you fit in order to be considered, you know, sort of normal and moral and doing the right thing, the very people they're hoping to connect with have themselves gone in different directions. Sometimes they've improved, sometimes they've just gone differently, sometimes they become worse, as in maybe like more violent, more kind of separatist, not separatist, isolationist. And they have to deal with that, and they have to examine themselves to say, why do I think my way is the best way? Why do I think I'm superior? Why do I think that this is the way to go? So that's what that journey is about. In the Best of All Possible Worlds, we meet Delarue's nephew, whose name is Rafi. Now, this is where I really kind of dug into the whole question of what is power and what is disability. Now, if you have no telepathy, it would be very difficult for you to function in a Sidiri society. If you have no empathy, it would be very challenging for you to be a full adult in an Achunic society. And Tenman, this middle name here, is in fact an example of someone who has no empathic ability, but is half Achunic and is trying to establish himself in that community, but is failing to do so because he's lacking that particular gift. But Rafi is different. Rafi is an outlier in Cygnus Beta. Takes after his father, who had such a strong power of persuasion that he was able to use it to control his family into perfect behavior. Now, when the authorities discovered this, he was actually, incarcerated, he was taken away, and the family had to go to therapy. But they didn't know what to do with Rafi because Rafi was at least as strong as his father. And they were afraid because they're like, he basically has this talent, this ability, which we don't have a societal framework for. It's a power that he might be able to use on others for ill. And we don't have any way for anyone to stop him or to punish him. So there's this journey that Rafi has to go through himself where he has to find a place where society can accept what he does, or at least be tolerant of what he does. He ends up going to Penarton, where the NPAPs are, in part because there are people there who, although they don't understand exactly what he does, they're not afraid of it because they have a certain amount of strength themselves in that area. And his story continues in a larger sense in the final book, Blue Beautiful World, because he now has to figure out how to use that same power completely for the good of Earth. So before, he's always been trying to channel it and suppress it and make it safe for everyone. And now he's in an environment where he has to be, everything that he had been teaching himself is wrong, but it has to be for a good purpose. And there's no one who can rein him back if things start to go wrong. Serendipity is the third name here. And serendipity is someone who comes from one of the Signian former Sugiri communities that actually improved their mental abilities. She came out of a society that was almost entirely telepathic, didn't even have to worry about speaking voice to voice to each other. But it wasn't as idyllic as you might think, because then there are questions of privacy. What is it like to grow up in something like that? Yes, there are going to be some boundaries and barriers you can put in your mind, but there's this sense of maybe almost stifling closeness. And just like how some of us are introverts and some of us are extroverts, I think there's some of us who are happy for the close community we're in, and some of us who are like, no, this is too much. I need to just get out by myself and do my own thing, and if it needs to, I'll just come back. Serendipity is an example of someone who's grown up in the closest of communities, and she is just desperate to leave. But she's in a bit of a Goldilocks situation. She's not finding a bed that's comfortable. The one she left is definitely not fitting her, but she's not been able to find something comfortable as yet. You see her journey a bit in the Galaxy game, but even more in the Blue Beautiful World, because what she has enables her to connect to the true non-human intelligences that actually are present on our own planet. So I've taken you through a very non-spoilery, I hope, kind of very quick look at all three books. And really, it's about how the spectrum between disability and power, there's so much connection there. A lot depends on external influences in terms of our society, people around us, our community. And even the psychological aspects, is this stigmatized or is this accepted? And in many ways, it does become a journey, both in the sense of we have to figure out in ourselves what's acceptable and what does not infringe on the rights of others. But we also have to be aware that as we physically move from location to location, the exterior rules are changing. And how do you account for that? How are you respectful of people's environments and their rules, while also perhaps not accepting things that they may not have right? You may actually have your own way of looking at things where you're like, the society may say this, but I can see from other examples that this is not the optimal way of doing things. So it's not a heroes and villains thing. It's not a hero's journey thing. It's very much of the individual within their society, within their community, and how we are constantly negotiating and compromising and figuring out how we fit. And sometimes having power in a particular way can almost be as limiting as having a lack of power. At this point, how are we doing? Yes, at this point, I think I can pause. And is this time for questions?
Yes, yeah, so let's give a pause for. So I'd like to open up to question, discussion, conversation, however we want to frame that. If anyone has any so far, I have quite a few I can use to fill up time. Get conversation going, I should say.
The real question I need to ask is, who here has read any of the books? Good.
Let's touch on that a bit, because I've only read the first one.
Mhm.
And the more that, I guess with a lot of world building and speculative fiction, the more that you get into it, just the more everything starts to kind of slowly come together. And then by the end of the first book,
Mhm.
it's just such a small puzzle piece in the entire, universe that I've just learned a lot just from watching this, because sometimes if you put it into that context, right, you can, but I'm also fascinated from your point of view as an author who's been within this world for so many years now. Like how has it kind of changed and come alive more perhaps for you, or have contextual events occurred within the time of writing that led it in different direction?
So, okay, so that's a good question, because I mentioned that a lot of my own experiences and work came sort of bled into the story itself. So when you look at the best of possible worlds, I was minded of when we had the Indian Ocean tsunami, and there were these fishing communities that indeed suffered that precise type of disaster where the fishermen were out, their families were on the coast. The wave wiped out their families and they were left alive. So that was just an example of a small community which suddenly experienced that huge disaster, that huge gender imbalance, and the kind of trauma that gives. So I found myself looking more and more at the displacedness aspect of things, and also the idea that a personal disaster in a book is interesting, but a collective disaster is another thing entirely. And the ways in which we deal with collective disaster. And let me explain exactly what I mean by this. There's so many books I have read where there's a collective disaster, but there's always this one hero. There's always this larger than life figure who kind of rides in there and has an outsized influence. My suspension of disbelief works fine with that as a reader. It doesn't function well as a writer. When I'm writing, I need to see community response. I need to see several people moving in a particular direction to be convinced that there can actually be some effect. So I do think that in some ways, one of the things that has happened as I got more and more stuck into this is I found myself pushing more and more away from some of the traditional structures of story in sci-fi. And I know some readers haven't been happy with that, but it means that every book is a little different. When you have a proper trilogy, that's why I hesitate to call it a trilogy sometimes, it's a series. When you have a trilogy, the reader, it's almost like you're giving a promise to the reader that what you sign on for book 1, I'll continue in book 2 and book 3. There are no surprises for you. I've already given you the flavor you should expect, and that's what's going to happen down the line. I haven't been so courteous. I've definitely been like, here's a nice road trip story with a side order romance. And then the next one is, oh, we're doing galactic politics today. Sorry if that bores you. So, and then by the time you reach the third one, the first part of it is almost like a spy thriller. Second bit is almost like a, sort of almost like a school for young adults type scenario. And then by the time you get to the third bit, we're back into diplomacy again, because apparently I can't get too far away from that. And there's a part of me that says, okay, I know how to do the structures, and I can do the structures that are comfortable to the reader, but I couldn't tell the story I want to tell. So as I got more and more attached to the universe and to the characters, I just kind of kept feeling, I just want to serve the story. If this story is going to be served by doing it in this weird way, let's just see what I can do with it. And if anything, my agent will put the brakes on me. Or the publisher will say, no, we can't accept this. But at the end of the day, I need to be comfortable with what I produce. I need to feel a certain level of satisfaction in terms of the conclusions that come to in the story, and how everything pulls together.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Lisa?
I mean, maybe building off your question, Chris, I was wondering if you could comment, and I'm so sorry I missed the beginning of this talk. So maybe you talked about some of this already. I was wondering if you could comment on maybe some of like the matriarchal stuff that comes in at the end of the book, where there's like there's like this one female Sidiri elder who's trying to like intimidate or maybe form the new young brides, and where that came from, or if you were going somewhere else with that.
This is fascinating. Okay, so the character she's describing is basically a Sidiri older woman, because there are indeed some women who have survived, but they're not of childbearing age. So where's their value? This is actually someone who is she's a religious, she's like I guess equivalent of a nun or so forth. She was actually Glenak's mentor in earlier times. And her job in a way is to look at those women who are going to be wives in the new Sidiri community and almost like vet them. And it's a very strong elder thing to do. It's a very auntie thing to do. Even beyond her status as a person who's like basically like a nun or a religious person or an abbot. But the reason I put it like that is that what she was doing is not different from how Sidiri society functioned in general. Sidiri society is an interesting mix of patriarchy and matriarchy. There's this aspect of the younger women don't necessarily have a lot of power, and their job is really to produce children and raise their kids, and they may do some other things, but somehow in there the producing of the family is still important. But then when you get to the older women are all about, well, this entire family, all the children and the grandchildren and the in-laws and the adoptees are my oversight. I have to be aware of who's coming in, and I have to just like be in such a level of control over this. So in some ways, Sidiri society starts off as a patriarchy and evolves into a matriarchy by the time you look at the elders. So the attitude that Zara was showing was entirely in line with what the Sidiri society was like. But I'm glad you picked that up. I'm not sure that many people realize that duality within Sidiri society. That on the one hand, it's very clear that especially when you see how the men operate, that it is a strong patriarchy, but it has elements of matriarchy as well. I would say in a way I'm looking at my own culture when you look at the West Indies. There are ways in which you're very matrilineal, and then there are ways in which we don't stay patriarchal.
One of my favorite moments in the book is when the Sidiri are trying to, they kind of ignore the instruction about other cultures at first and just start having children. And then they're shocked to realize that the women have power.
Yes, exactly. So exactly. So they were not conforming to the expectations. And that was when, oh, sorry, I just want to say, one of the inventions I'm most proud of in that book is the invention of the Ministry of Family Planning and Maintenance.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I'm not really sure how my question is formulating yet, but you were talking at the very beginning about telepathy and being an empath is something that is often we see in science fiction and speculative fiction. And I'm wondering in your books how your characters might sort of grapple with the power that comes with that to some degree. And often I think in many fictional worlds or universes, it's women who are given that power or have that power and then are denigrated for having that power. So I'm wondering about sort of, I guess, the moral gray areas of having some of that power when not everybody might have it, and how that plays into perhaps the characters who don't, or the character you said who is sort of comes from across multiple worlds here.
Well, that's a very good question, and some of it has to do with when you have planets that are familiar with each other and already have like shall we say cross-cultural structures in place, there's a way in which people are not concerned because they know what they're supposed to do. So there's a bit where Lena, for example, he asked one of his juniors to teach Delarua some of the disciplines, because Delarua, it turns out, has a little bit of abilities herself, but can't quite control them, and this is supposed to help her. And the junior officer basically says, but you know that you're the better teacher, why don't you do it? He's like, I'm her friend, you know, we're friends now, and I don't want that power imbalance. I don't want her to become my student. And there's a little bit just after that, where they actually like test her abilities, and he comes in. First they test it using chemicals, so there's no chemicals to change your mood or whatever. And then he comes in as a sort of a non-chemical influence, and then she becomes very aware as to exactly how strong he is mentally, but he never shows that. Because here's the example that we have here. Me, I'm like barely 5 foot one of it. Okay. There are a lot of humans who are taller and stronger than me. But just being taller and stronger doesn't mean you're always showing me that strength. Doesn't mean you're always pushing me around. Because our society has understanding and a structure that says if you're a bigger person, there are ways in which you still respect the autonomy and the personal boundaries of someone who's smaller than you. And when that doesn't happen, the person is understood to have stepped beyond the line. So I did think of telepathy and empathy in those terms, where they have internalized from very young, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. You know, we wouldn't go and, you know, push over somebody smaller. They're not gonna try to crush someone who doesn't have that mental ability. And this is why Rafi's father was such a problem, because he was not socialized in society that could tell him what you're doing is not okay.
It's really a privilege to have you on. So thank you for taking time to come all the way to Vancouver, and I'm really sorry about the weather. I would love to hear a little bit more about your experiences as a diplomat and what compelled you to think about writing in this way, and drawing on that experience.
Well, writers are like magpies. We can't help but pick up all the little pieces and scraps of our lives and other people's lives who don't have it. In terms of my experience as a diplomat, I always say that one of the key factors of me is being a diplomat of a microstate is a very interesting space to be in. Because on the one hand, when you look at the UN, the representative from Barbados is next to the representative from the US. And we have, like, you know, just a little over 250,000 people, a little scrap of land, 166 square miles. And we are in the same space, and people who are representing larger populations, usually far larger land mass, lots of resources in many cases. There's not a lot of resources in Barbados. But we get to be a part of that. We get to have a seat at the table. It's a very interesting kind of space to be in. And one of the things that I realize that allows us to have usefulness in that kind of context is that we can often be the person who doesn't have a stake in the game. So if you are able to, you know, because we have no power, sometimes what we say can be taken more or less at face value, because we have no influence or strength to force anyone to do anything. There's ways in which people talk to us in almost like a more open way. And this is not to say that this always happens as perfection, but when I was in the Oxford Foreign Service program, where we're all the students are all like mid-level diplomats from various countries, I enjoyed just talking to people about the things in their lives and their experience. And I feel that sometimes they were able to express themselves to me in ways that they might have felt more constrained, speaking to someone more powerful. The ones that stand out in my mind, the student from Croatia telling me about his experiences during the war. The student from Ecuador telling me about what it was like when the economy crashed so severely. The student from Micronesia explained to me how to rig a sail for a boat sailing across the Pacific, because his grandfather had actually done a stars only navigation to Japan. So this was like part of his history. So these are all things that I felt, I don't even know if they would have felt as easy to talk to me about these things, but it just makes you realize that sometimes being kind of small and inoffensive and not having a lot of power can still actually leverage that in interesting ways. You're probably gonna ask me why I didn't stick with it. Well, I came from a science background. At the time that I joined, I was supposed to be doing more like IT and diplomacy, but when you're in such a small scale foreign service, you don't get to stay with specialties. And I thought, this is too far from what I really started off with, so I need to like pull it back a bit. So that's what happened. But it was very interesting. It was very interesting, and I still have people that I worked with who are now ambassadors, which is fascinating to me, just blows my mind. But time passes, people rise up in the ranks. That's what happens. And yes, it was definitely a way for me to see and understand the world from a unique vantage point, where I always say the smaller your house, the more you want to look out the windows.
Can I just ask a brief follow-up that kind of, I think, merges some of these questions that we've had? How your work as a diplomat and, traveler influences the separation that you have in the novels between the telepathic people and the empathetic people, because there's our former chair of our department that famously came up with these concepts of the transparent eye to like talk about colonialism, colonizers, white Europeans, basically, and then the affective eye as an interesting, kind of fascinating way of splitting up and just kind of giving some focus to the kind of subjectivities and also stereotypes that are attached to them. I thought your novels do that in a really fascinating way, and I'm just wondering how those two things you kind of see together, because it is a science fiction convention, but it's also something that science fiction always is about colonialism too.
When you started talking, something sparked in my mind. So now I have to say that my answer may be a little bit of a segue, but honestly, you sparked it. So you talked about the difference between telepathy and empathy. And it struck me, I always had this theory as being more of a enclosed society. They are the former empire. It's a more benign empire, but they have the imperialist tendencies. They like to be in control. They feel they have the right to be in control, and so forth. So when you look at their telepathy is a very internal gift. It's very much about, just what's happening within there. But when I look at Nshune and Punartan with the empathy, I actually see them as being more outward looking, able to, it's still a case of, that you're not going to be able to fully participate in the empath society without the empathic ability yourself. But they are more willing to look outwards, to be, even the fact that Punartan is a colony of theirs and it is almost on equal footing with the whole planet. There are other reasons, geological reasons for that, but the main thing that sort of tells me, and yes, I'm always discovering within my own works what I'm trying to tell myself, is that there is this accepting nature within the Nshune thing, which was less imperial, which is less colonial minded, which is more about, respect for other people's growth and so forth. And I don't even know if they would frame it exactly like that, but I do think it ties back to what the empathy does for them. I think you had a question.
Yeah, actually, the question was already asked, and then the follow-up certainly was very good. I'll spin it a little bit. I'm really fascinated by lives of writers, particularly those who have moved from the sciences, social sciences, the world of diplomacy, and then into literary fiction of a grand scale, like the beyond, what we talk about, the transnational, the global, right? It's really galactic. And I know some retired colleagues who are thinking of going into writing novels and more, the not so usual things we do in the social sciences. And so my question is, what sort of imaginations do you mobilize in that shift from, the sciences to literature? And what advice will you give to those science and social science, natural science, social science colleagues who are thinking in writing their own, fiction,
So
literary works?
I do have an answer for you, but it may not be a helpful one. And that is when you look at the places I've studied and the work I've done, underlying all of it is the fact that I've always had a very cross-disciplinary mind. So nothing was a switch. I was already growing up on, Narnia Chronicles and Lord of the Rings. I was already writing back poetry in my teens and trying to write short stories in university. I was, in fact, one of the fascinating things, I went to my undergraduate at University of Toronto, and I came out of a school system, the British oriented school system, where the arts and the sciences are very separate. And you had to choose. So when I had to choose, I chose physics and to go down that stream. But when I came into U of T, they had something called a BAC requirement, which was that if you're doing sciences, you need to do at least 3 other full courses that are not in the sciences at all. And then as I dug a little deeper, I discovered there's this course called History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, well, a whole bunch of courses. And the History of Science and Technology specialist required you to have what was the equivalent of about 2/3 of a major anyway. So I ended up with a minor in astronomy, a major in physics, and a specialist in history of science and technology. It should have been a Bachelor of Arts because your specialist should take precedent, but I had more science courses and arts courses. So in my first act of rebellion in my life, I think, I went to the admin and I said, well, look at this. You can't give me a BA. It's obviously a BSc. And they were like, oh, okay, we think you're right. And I negotiated my way to a BSc that way. But there was always that cross-disciplinary approach. There's always that cross-disciplinary interest. So everything that I did since then was just out of a broad curiosity of the world. So never a switch. So if you already have that level of curiosity where you are, reading every article in the news, where you're imagining things, where you're looking at, television series and imagining, writing fan fiction, whatever the case may be, it's not going to be a switch for you. It's just going to be an evolution into a different expression.
I think that's a helpful. Have you been approached already by Hollywood or Netflix to turn this into a movie?
My agent is nodding. Let's just say that I haven't been so definitely approached in a way that writers are always cynical. We're always like, until the signatures on the contract, we're not gonna be happy with it. So there's nothing that I have put my name to. There's just been like little whiffs of, this is interesting, whatever. But as a writer, I can't get excited about what ifs in the real world, only in fiction.
Thank you.
Yes, JP.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about readership, and as an author, your relationship to readers. You mentioned a couple of times, readers might not be happy about the direction you're taking. And part of my question is around reception. And also possibly if it exists, readerly interventions into the worlds that you are building. Whether it's like fan fiction, for example, or integration into your subsequent writing of readerly kinds of readings into your work.
Okay, that's a very good question. So the bit that I wanted to do at the beginning, but didn't think my voice was gonna last, was to tell you a bit about my background. I was born in Barbados, I grew up in Barbados, I live in Barbados now. I always say to people who read my works, I am a foreigner. You need to understand that if you're gonna understand what I write. So don't come into it with an assumption that I have this sort of like North American framework. That's sort of underpinning everything that I do. I'm a foreigner. We have already noticed that the way readers in the Caribbean react to my work is different from the way readers in North America do. Is different from the way European readers do, Australian. I'm always fascinated at the differences that I encounter in various places. I was saying, Richard, recently, I feel as if British readers of mainstream fiction enjoy my work more than British SF readers, because they're more like hard SF kind of hard, some sort of very strict genre boundaries sort of thing. So I'm still learning. I'm still learning what readers, because I don't just look at readers for the country in which my book is published or for the publishers of these. I'm looking at the entire world. And I if I had the easy access to that, I don't know, I probably would be selling better. But you said something else which is really fascinating. You said something about fan fiction and fan interventions. So I don't go looking for fan fiction. I mean, most authors find that's an exercise in pain. But some authors are very happy to have their work done as fan fiction. No one has ever told me they found it out there. I have a suspicion that it's probably difficult to write fan fiction in my work because the flavor is probably hard for them to capture. But I had a very excellent experience with a reviewer in Spain who, and this will happen, as a reader, she made a real personal connection with the work. And then what happened is a friend of hers who is in Brazil contacted me and said, could you sign your books and send them to my friend in Spain? I'll pay for all the costs and so on, but I want her to have this as a Christmas gift. And I said, very off the cuff, because I really wasn't thinking straight, postage between Barbados, Brazil, Spain is going to be madness. Why don't I just write a story for her? And the moment I said, I'm like, anyway, but I did that. So I was like, I was speaking to the friend in Brazil, and I was like, what kind of sort of in-jokes do you have as friends? Which character you think she's more interested in or whatever. And I wrote a story and I sent her this, and then, sorry, I should give the whole context. There's a colleague of mine, Tobias Mikkel, who's very good at like ebook publishing and so on. So he helped me like put it all into like a proper ebook. The same friend in Brazil is actually an artist, like a qualified master's level artist, and she did an illustration for it. We added illustration that the reviewer in Spain had done, because she was not a professional artist, but that was her response, not fan fiction, but the images. And she got this as a Christmas gift. And it was honestly one of the best things I ever did. And if you look at the reprint for, let me get this straight, the reprint for the Galaxy game has that story in it. It's called Tapestry. And it's something I'm very proud of, because even though I committed to it very, very off the cuff, the actual work of doing it was fascinating to me, because you do indeed step out of yourself and start thinking about, what does this reader want? What's going to connect with them even more? What's going to be significant to them? And I really enjoyed it.
I'll just ask a quick follow-up to that. Like when first starting Best of All Possible Worlds, I did feel like, and then I read some reviews that completely like blew my mind about where my own expectations were coming from. But it begins with this horrible tragedy, and you just immediately expect that this is the thing that we're gonna like, the wrong that will be righted.
Yes, that's the traditional way, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was quite hard, even as someone who's like, critical of those things and written my own creative work. It was just somewhat hard to just get out of that space. And I think there's kind of characters who say those things to the Siduri. What's next? What's the plan? And that almost put my own sense of as a reader to shame, because some of the ways that they react to it is just, how could we possibly think about that right now? Like how could you even go there, right? And there's just those wounds that are just so open, and sometimes they'll say like, well, it's an interior matter, we're dealing with it. But as the book unfolds in the road trip narrative, which is very common in some science fiction, or in fantasy, like Lord of the Rings is kind of a
Yes.
road trip. It's not all that, but I think once you take those stakes and say like, that is important, but we're gonna leave it here, and it's actually this like romantic thing and all this other and diaspora story, it becomes so unique and so fulfilling in ways that like I think as a reader you don't really see coming. And I wonder, because when I was reading the reviews, I did find like, oh, my whole thing was also what a lot of people's expectations are going into things. Yeah, like was that something that I've seen you in conversations where you talk about, or people ask you about decolonizing sci-fi. I don't know if that was a particular attempt to do so, but it has
cannot be an
that-
attempt. Unless decolonizing is simply being myself, it can't be an attempt. It's just the way I would view the approach to this. When you have a disaster that huge, yes, it is common for, we say, the North American readers to think we're gonna focus on this, and there's gonna be some, as you say, turnaround or redemption, or but I come from a region that has seen disaster after disaster after disaster. We've seen wars, we've seen genocide, we've seen all kinds of be it hurricane, earthquake, whatever. And if there's one thing I've come to appreciate when I look at not only our history, my parents' stories, my grandparents' stories, and even my present time, is that we just get on with it, a level of humor. And that's what I'm writing about there. I mean, this is a more recent thing, but we all had the pandemic. That was our global collective trauma. But in about the second year of the pandemic, Barbados also had I think it was in 2021, a lightning storm that was so fierce it did horrible things to our electrical grid. We had a hurricane, first hurricane properly hit the island in about almost 50 years or more. And we had ashfall from a volcanic eruption at a neighboring island. And when I say ashfall, let me give context. This same volcano had erupted when I was a child, and the ash that we had was just like grains of sand. It was more like, oh, this is interesting, and you scoop it up and you put it in a matchbox and whatever. So when they were saying to us, oh, ashfall is coming over from Soufriere and St. Vincent, those of us who lived through that time were thinking, oh, it's just gonna be more of that. And then the noonday sun was blotted out. And we were like, what is this? And it was traumatic. And then we were left with massive amounts of ash, like snow that doesn't melt. And we had to spend time digging ourselves out of this ash, and also the wind keeps whipping it up. So I think there was 2 weeks where all I did was clean the house every day. And you have to clean it in stages, because it's like at a certain point you realize you have to clean your outside windowsills, because you can't ever open the window without more ash going in. And then you got to sweep your yard properly, and then there's the whole neighborhood, and trees still have ash in. And the people's reaction were just like a combination of, yes, I'm traumatized, and well, I'm still gonna make a joke about this. And that's what I find more true to life and to fiction. I think another author that does this pretty well is Terry Pratchett. And I like Terry Pratchett a lot. Another way of saying some very serious things in a way that's deceptively lighthearted.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
I was thinking about how it's it's so tough to think of this as academic work. But that's why we're challenging ourselves, right? We need to expand our understanding of what theorizing in academy is about. And then I was thinking about how Octavia Butler also kind of engages in speculative fiction, and has social commentary. And your book also had aspects of social commentary in it. But what I wanted to know is, did you write with an intention of there being social commentary in it? Or were you just writing a story and you're like, well, this kind of makes sense to the real world as well?
There is never any just. The moment I have built a world that allows me to suspend my disbelief as a writer, it means that I have internalized certain theories and understanding of the real world that I am transferring to the fictional one. So it may not be that I have a list of references, of academic references for every point that I made. But I know I've done all the work in the back. I know what my PhD is in, I know what my master's is in, I know what my experience has been. And I don't have to do a one-on-one example, a one-on-one connection to everything that's in the book. But nothing is ever just a story. It comes from somewhere. It comes from somewhere. And people like to talk about author intention and whatever. Author intention is like still just a fraction of it. There's almost a mythic aspect to it where you are in a way possessed by something. And maybe that something is in your subconscious, or maybe it's almost external to you, like a story that is demanded to be told and it defines you. But there's never any just. But in terms of academia, in terms of the academic worth of the book, fun fact. So my first manuscript, which is Redemption in Indigo, won a literary award in Barbados. And this was around the time of the Great Recession. And the prize came with a cash award. We need to have more of those. And I was still broke, and I was writing the best of all possible worlds. But I said to myself, I can see them giving an award to something that's a bit folkloric and very Caribbean. I can't see them giving it to this very obviously science fiction story. But I'm broke, and what the heck? I'll just put it in there and I'll see what they make of it. And it won again. And I was the only person to win like 2 years in a row. There was a professor at the University of West Indies who was on the board for both prizes, both years. And one of the best compliments I ever got in my writing was when she came to me and said, I thought that Redemption in Indigo was the one that had the most like literary content. But the more I delve into the best of all possible worlds, the more I see to teach from it, the more I see that it has in it. And I was just like, and I do think that in the Caribbean, our sense of the genre boundary is a little less rigid. I have had almost a bit of cognitive dissonance going overseas and having people react to me in an almost snobbish fashion because it's like, oh, you write science fiction, and then they dismiss you, and I'm like, that's not what they do where I come from. But you understand that, again, it's a difference between cultures, a difference between societies, a difference between different academias. Speculative fiction, in the sense of portraying a world that's not fully real, has been a strong theme in Caribbean literature for ages. And we are not, we don't look down on it. So that's the background I come from. And as I said, anytime you're writing a story, you're pulling from all kinds of things. And yes, after I've written, I can go back and say, oh, I know where that came from, I know where that came from, and clearly I was channeling this. But that's the job of the reviewer. I already wrote the darn. So I leave it to the academics and the reviewers to pick down the fine details. And sometimes they tell me things that I don't even know about. Sometimes I'm like, oh, wait a minute. That was what I was getting at there. And that to me has huge value. So I do love these kind of conversations where I can also discover more of my own work.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. I think that's a great place to end too. Let's give a hand to our. So our next speaker series event will be on Wednesday, November 1st from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Same room, same time. It will feature 2 GRSJ faculty members, Isabel Machado and Roseanne Sia, who will speak jointly about their works in relation to joyful defiance and performance. And so I hope to see you there. Thank you again. And we have food, so please eat. Maybe I can tell you were.
It's like when village have decided to cooperate, I'm not.
Hello.
I'm just.